Welcome this evening to, this is the second of 4 information sessions that we have scheduled before Christmas on the draft local environmental plan. Before I start this presentation, well, my name is Lee Morgan and I'm the Director of Development and Customer Services with the Council. But I first want to acknowledge that we're meeting here tonight on the traditional lands of the Darug and the Gundungurra peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. This evening's presentations will be done by about 4 other speakers, and Andy Turner, the City Planner, is one of those, and we've got several senior planners, Michelle Maher, Kim Barrett and Martin Beveridge, who will follow me. And the Director of City and Community Outcomes, Steve Corbett, is also here with us this evening. You can see there the agenda for this evening. I'll talk about the first 2 points and then other speakers will join us. Before moving on, I want to underscore how important the public submission process is for this draft local environmental plan. It's quite a large and challenging piece of work, and the exhibition and making submissions are not just a minor byproduct. They're a major part of it, and we look forward to any comments you've got, concerns, or things that indeed you want to make submissions about, things that you think should be done differently, or if you think there are any errors. So I really urge you to do that, and so will other speakers. So by way of background, this evening is really about, there's a lot of information to get through. We're trying to lift it up to the key points and give you an overview of how the draft plan works and what it's aiming to achieve. It's not about site-specific discussions or detailed discussion around what can be some quite complex provisions and objectives, I think, that we're trying to satisfy. That you'll hear at the end more about how you can pursue the detail in terms of particularly site-specific. There'll be details given at the end about the drop-in centre as well as all the other resources. You've seen some of those at the rear of the room, and that'll be there also as you leave. These presentations are being recorded and they'll be available on our websites. So that includes both this address but also the PowerPoint presentation, so you needn't be taking notes. That is of assistance to you. In terms of where we're at the moment, we've got 3 local environmental plans that govern the city. One of them, LEP 4, is got very minor remnant elements. LEP 1991 and LEP 2005 are what we call our 2 major parent instruments, and they govern the city. The more inner urban areas, and then in 2005, and the more peripheral areas under LEP 1991. As you can see from those numbers, 1991, that was the year it was gazetted, and 2005, that was the year that the inner urban area was gazetted. When LEP 1995 was prepared, it was proposed that the next step would be to roll LEP 1991, the older instrument around more the urban bushland interface, into LEP 2005 before then moving into a possibly standard instrument format that the government was looking for. The standard instrument format from the state government, which is called, as you can see there on the screen, Standard Instrument Order 2006, came out only just after LEP 2005 was gazetted. And Council nonetheless had an agreement from the Department for a good number of years to still proceed to consolidate LEP 1991 into 2005 before doing the next step. However, last year in July, we were given a very short time frame to say, no, you've got to get on and move both instruments into the standard instrument. So, of necessity, that has meant that the scope of this work is really quite limited, although that still has been a significant task, and that is we're converting and translating as close as possible the existing framework under the current planning instruments into a standard instrument template. And that has meant that this is really not about doing major policy reviews, but you will hear a bit more tonight about how we've gone about that. But as an overview, in terms of principles of how we've gone about it, yes, we've tried to apply a consistent planning approach across the local government area. As I've just said, we've got two planning instruments. LEP 1991 was at the time quite innovative and almost revolutionary. It was addressing the highly sensitive, constrained land around the margins of the city at the bushland-urban interface. So it was very strong in environmental protection and trying to limit development to the capacity of the land and the landscape, whilst providing appropriate development opportunities. LEP 2005 had a lot more mapping done, and it contains a lot more urban-type development and therefore has different clauses. So LEP, remembering that we're a city within a World Heritage listed national park system, there still has been quite a strong view expressed by a number of councils that we do need to try and retain the key elements of our existing planning framework. LEP 2005, whilst taking a lot of LEP 1991 principles, it's developed them, in the environmental protection principles, with the aid of a lot more detailed mapping and detailed resolution into the landscape. And you'll hear a little bit more about that as it's relevant to residential development tonight. What we've tried to do is use the standard instrument format wherever we can with the translation. Because we do, the government's objectives, I think, are a very worthy one. By standardising as much as possible, we can try and make development assessment and management more efficient and streamlined for the community, the development community and community members across the state. So there's many benefits, and some things really are quite translatable. So LEP 2005 has really a reasonable number of clauses in it which are much the same as what's in the LEP. It also has a lot of the common definitions, and so to some degree does LEP 1991. So there is really quite a little bit of a base there. We're able to do a direct translation. Where there's not an equivalent provision in the standard instrument, we've used the best fit approach. And sometimes we've had to do something differently. So there's different zone names. There are different ways of doing things like managing and controlling subdivision, for example. But the aim has been to retain the same sort of outcome in the way we've done that. And tonight we'll be concentrating on describing how we've done that as it relates in particular to residential development. Now, lastly, there has been some limited new policy introduced, and generally that's sprung from either external things that have changed and external government initiatives and studies and things that have become available, or the fact that we need to represent external policy. But we did also, the Council had over the last number of years really started to move towards a review of LEP 1991 and had commissioned some studies. And the Council had, as part of that, identified some things that they thought should be occurring. So there has been some limited new policy that has been imported as well, but that's identified in the planning proposal. Before moving on to focus more on the residential area, I wanted to underscore or emphasise that the Council, and as I say, it's been a number of councils, it's been 3 councils at least, who have lobbied the state government to say we need to retain a planning framework which achieves the same outcomes as do our current instruments. And there were several key provisions that really were not well accommodated in the standard instrument template. And just very briefly, I'll describe those for you, because these things are still potentially at risk. They have all been agreed, ultimately, by the government to be part of the exhibited plan, but they do remain at risk. And I'll just give you an overview of those, and then some of them will be expanded on in the later presentations. First of all, strong threshold tests really means we have got plan objectives and we have got zone objectives. And in our current instruments, development needs to comply with those objectives. And it's really quite a strong direction as to what needs to occur before development can achieve a development consent. In the standard instrument, it only says you must have regard to. It's a much weaker test, and we felt that the outcomes for our city are so important and quite unique in many ways, and we needed to retain that strength. A schedule of significant vegetation communities means that we wanted a clear description of different ecological communities that are of significance in the Blue Mountains. Some of them are of local significance, and some of them are also in the Threatened Species Conservation Act and nominated there. But we didn't just want to map them because we've got a very complex landscape, and biodiversity is a key value of our city and protection of that. So whilst we have done a lot more mapping of these significant vegetation communities, we have also retained the listing of the schedule. And I don't know that that's something that's been done anywhere else. It makes it very clear just what those, describes the key vegetation communities, and it identifies that they need to be protected, or at least we must have regard to them and properly consider them if they have not been mapped, but they do occur on land. Because the process of mapping at the scale and the fineness in the complexity of our landscape is really beyond capturing everything at 1 to 6,000, 12,000 or 25,000 maps. So we think that's very important. We've asked for additional flexibility in our instrument, which is not in the standard instrument, and that is in relation to what are currently private environmental protection zones. We've got a lot of what are known as split land use zones in the mountains, because you will see quite commonly on the ridge tops we've got a road, then we've got development parcel or developable part of a lot, and then the lots tail off into often quite steep gullies and with watercourses and steep land and vegetated slopes. Those areas are, those steeply sloping vegetated areas and watercourses are often zoned environmental protection, but the front part of the lot has got a development capacity with a residential zone over it. Our instruments at the moment allow site-specific considerations so that the residential part of the development can intrude up to 10 metres into an EP zone to accommodate the needs of the residential development and where it's consistent with the zone objectives and the detail of what's happening on the land. It goes back also to that issue of us not being able to map everything accurately at the site scale. Stormwater quality. We require currently, because of the sensitivity of the receiving environment from our development, that stormwater cannot be, it can't be degraded. There can't be impacts from our stormwater on the receiving environment by degradation in that stormwater quality and quantity. That's a higher level test than is in the current standard instrument. It is the same level test that's in our current instruments, and it's also equivalent to the test that's in the drinking water catchments regulation. And quite a bit of our receiving environment is also Sydney drinking water catchment. Just before I move from this, the new character land use zone, we felt there was a need for that, and you'll hear a bit more about that tonight, so I won't talk about that more, but that's possibly the most at-risk issue. So when that's talked about this evening, it would be good to to pay attention to that if you can, and if you're interested in that, have a look at it and perhaps support it. The last two things, period housing areas. We've got a lot of pre-World War II housing that forms a lot of the areas of or comprises a lot of the areas of valued character. They may not be specifically heritage items in their own right, but you will see a lot of that housing, particularly in the upper mountains, but not only the upper mountains, and that is valued by the community, and we want to be able to protect it. And lastly, at the moment, our 2005 LEP has a place-based precinct controls for each of our village centres and other higher density development areas around it. And it talks about desired future character, objectives, and then it's got the relevant development controls that go with that. We're not able to have that integrated package in the standard instrument, but it has been agreed that whilst we have to disaggregate the development standards and some of the design guidelines, we can keep and retain precinct controls and objectives for each of the town centre precincts, and we think that will yield a reasonable result if that goes forward like that. I'm not going to go through that. That just gives you an overview of how a draft LEP looks in terms of structure and content. Clearly, not everywhere has to have additional local provisions if they don't want it, or locality management, but all those other parts are mandated, and you'll be able to go to an LEP anywhere and expect to see it structured like that once they've adopted the standard instrument. Some other general issues to note: land use definitions in the definitions table must now be the same across the state. The land use table is written in the same sort of form across the state. We have elected to illustrate that by a matrix, which makes it easier. It's a grid which you can see in zones what land uses are permissible, what are prohibited, what require consent and what don't. That's the way our current instruments are written, and I think they're far more user-friendly. We're not able to do that in the standard instrument, but as I say, we have done a matrix. It stands outside the instrument, but it's an information resource to help us and to help you more readily see what's permissible where. Equivalent zones, we've had to adopt from the zone palette under the standard instrument, those that are appropriate to our area. I won't talk about that more now because the other presentations will do that, and we've had a good fit other than the living conservation zone, and we'll talk about that. The draft plan also has a mix of compulsory, optional and local clauses. And probably lastly, but not leastly, maps are meant to be looked at digitally, and we've had to do a lot more separate map layers than our current LEP. So it's not as user-friendly in many ways. We've tried to make it as user-friendly as possible, but it is still more challenging, I'm afraid. But we've put a tool up there to help you by lot, by property, get a more global picture without having to sift through, 40 or 50 map layers. Michelle knows the detail, I'm sure, but I won't bore you with it anyway. That's just it's just a quick overview on how the different types of clauses are represented in the written instrument. So the black ones are the mandatory clauses. We must use them, or if we're going to, if it's not applicable, you can put not applicable, but their place has got to be kept in the standard instrument. The red are optional, and they're generally in a settled form, which are used elsewhere. And the green are the changes that we particularly want, and they're particular to Blue Mountains. I won't really dwell on these because, as I say, it is covered more later, but that's a table which shows the standard instrument zones on the right, and the zones that are in our current instruments on the left, and it lines them up. And once again, as I say, I won't talk more about that new zone which we proposed, the R6 residential character conservation, because that is covered in the following presentation. So I will now hand over to Kim Barrett. Thank you, Kim.
Hello, my name's Kim Barrett, and I'll be taking you through the residential zones and the land uses. So this is a comparison table of the residential zones under the draft LEP, and then comparing those with zones within LEP 2005, LEP 1991 and LEP 4. So as you can see there, for example, the R2 zone, low density residential, is equivalent or broadly equivalent to the living general zone that we have now. And as Lee mentioned, we have living conservation zone under LEP 2005. There is no equivalent in the standard instrument as far as we've assessed. And so we have proposed the R6 zone, residential character conservation. And that is something that's unique in the state. So as far as I'm aware, I think that's right, there's no other LGA that has a zone outside the standard instrument template. So as we mentioned before, it is at risk in the sense that the department, until the instrument is finalised, until the LEP is finalised, it's not secure. So we may not retain that, but we're hoping we can. And then the E3 and E4 zones, environmental management and environmental living, E4 is equivalent to the living bushland conservation zone under 2005 LEP, and also to the residential bushland conservation and residential investigation, and the E3 equivalent to bushland conservation in 1991. So these zones are outside of the group of residential zones identified in the standard instrument, but they recognise the unique character of those areas in the Blue Mountains. So with their natural landscape character and the retention of natural bushland in those areas. The place to go, which you may have already got this from the back of the room, you can also get it online, is fact sheet 11 for residential zones. So this details some of what I've just spoken about, and also in quite a lot more detail, the differences in the zones. So it's laid out there similarly to what I showed you before. R2, they're equivalent to the living general zone, and some broader description there about those zones. And then the R3 zone, medium density residential, and then in the box that you can see on the screen, the R6 zone. So in terms of land use definitions, land uses are defined in the dictionary in the local environmental plan, and they're at the end of the document. Land uses are uniform throughout New South Wales and are also consistent with many state environmental planning policies. So as Lee was mentioning before, the standardisation of planning across the state is intended to simplify things. So if you went to any LGA, any local government area in the state, the definitions, the land uses are the same. So in terms of the positioning of land use in the zoning table, so that's an example similar to what Lee was showing you before. The way that it's organised in the LEP, the objectives are there first, and then it lists what's permitted without consent, what is permitted with consent, and then anything that's not listed in those two areas is prohibited in that zone. So that's quite a different style to LEP 2005. And similarly there you can see the green and red text. The green objectives are ones that we have added that we believe are relevant to that zone. And the red text there are the optional permitted uses that you can include. And the black are the ones that the department have said you have to have in that zone. So in terms of land use definitions, the way that it's organised, existing land use definitions under our 3 LEPs, they're not necessarily the same. So you'd find something in 1991 LEP that you wouldn't find in 2005. And often the land uses are very specific to the Blue Mountains. So we have a number of uses that you wouldn't find elsewhere in other LGAs. And the other, I guess, characteristic of them is that they're unrelated definitions. They stand alone. And this is probably one of the core differences between the situation that we have now and the way that it's organised under the standard instrument LEP. What's proposed is that the definitions are statewide, as I mentioned, but the interesting thing is that they're grouped together. So I'll show you something a bit more simple in a minute, but this is the land use matrix that Lee was referring to. So across the top, we have all of the different zones, and down the left-hand side, all of the land uses. The zones there are grouped into rural or residential or business. And on the left-hand side, you can see some bold text. That is the group term. And then underneath it are all the different definitions that fall within that group. That's very different to what we've had before. So as a way of describing it more clearly, hopefully, the group terms are kind of like the parent term. So it does work similarly to a family tree in some respects. And then there's a subset, and then terms even as a third tier or under that. So group terms include all of the subsets, and then there's some subsets that have their own terms. So in terms of having a more simplified LEP, this is probably one area where it's a little bit more complicated. There are also some terms that stand alone. So as an example, there's a group term there, for example, of air transport facility, and then under that, an airport or a heliport. Not necessarily something we'd have up here, but nevertheless, that's how it works. So in terms of residential accommodation, the group term is residential accommodation, and then under that you can see the whole list of things that apply there. So, for example, dwelling houses, dual occupancies, things like that. And then within dual occupancy, there's the attached or detached type. Now, I won't go into this in too much detail, and it's something that you can find information about on the website, but interestingly, in the standard instrument, if everything within the group is permissible or everything within the group is allowed in a particular zone, it will only be the group term that's listed there. So if, for example, residential accommodation, we permit every single thing in that list, the only thing that will be listed is residential accommodation. So I guess going back to this list, it's kind of good to know what's in each group, because then you know what might be permitted there. In terms of residential accommodation, there are some terms that aren't within this broader list. Things like camping grounds, home business, home occupation. So home occupation obviously occurs within a dwelling, but it's not in that previous list. It sits separately. Also, bed and breakfast accommodation is identified within tourist and visitor accommodation and not within the residential area. So there are a few layers to get through when you're looking for particular development types. So as we heard before, most land uses in our LEPs have an equivalent land use under the new draft LEP. And the new land use definitions that we have are from the standard instrument. So we've had to use those definitions. Where there's an equivalent, it is the definition that's in the standard LEP. In terms of land uses that are captured under SEP infrastructure and SEP affordable housing, so SEP stands for State Environmental Planning Policy, and there are some land uses that are captured under that state legislation, and they're, as a rule, not listed in the local environmental plan either. So an example of that might be seniors housing, which falls under the seniors living state policy, and that as a rule wouldn't be listed. So in terms of fact sheet 11, that's a little bit more detail there. So on that fact sheet you can see a comparison between what is permitted now without consent and what would be under the new zone, what is permitted with consent and what would be under the new zone, and what's prohibited and similarly under the new zone. So you can get that information there. So here's an example of currently under living general, permitted without consent is bush regeneration. There is no equivalent of that under the new instrument, under the new LEP. And the example that you can see there in red, permitted with consent, telecommunications facilities are permitted with consent under the living general zone in the LEP 2005. And that now is covered by one of those state policies I was talking about, the Infrastructure State Environmental Planning Policy, and so it's not within the draft LEP. So the R6 residential character zone, as we've said a couple of times now, is at risk. It's a new standard instrument zone, doesn't exist anywhere else in the state, and it's equivalent to our living conservation zone in LEP 2005. There is no guarantee that it will be retained post-exhibition, and however the basis for the zone has strong planning merit, and it is something that defines a lot of areas within the Blue Mountains, the landscape character that we have, and it's quite different to any zone that would be broadly considered equivalent under the standard instrument. So we will be relying on public support so that we can make a case to the department to keep it. And sure.
What do you envisage the government saying you should, if they don't want that, what do you envisage them saying it will do?
The option that was put forward was R5, which I guess is equivalent to a rural residential zone. So the characteristics of that would be very large lots. I suppose something that you would find, I know the North Coast well, so a subdivided farm that has a rural residential element, which really doesn't take up the characteristics of our living conservation zones. So that was what was proposed as the closest possible under the standard instrument.
How do you envisage public would support that? In what way?
In submissions is the main way. So if you are aware of areas that are zoned in that way, or you live in those areas, then if you like the way it looks now and that the zone should be, similar to what you've got, then that would be the best way to do it.
And the public submissions are only reviewed by the council, or are they passed on?
They're passed on. So it informs, I guess, how we're reviewing the standard instrument as it is now, and then we provide that feedback to the department, and it does support us in making the arguments or keeping what we've proposed. Yeah.
Sorry, that's not our understanding. The department have been supportive really of what we've got out on exhibition rather than those at-risk things that we talked about. Yeah.
So if I just clarify perhaps, clearly from the green paper, in terms of planning reform, we've seen a move that's scheduled out all of our residential zones. But in the draft white paper that we saw all of those being potentially lost at one particular point. So if you're calling, at that time when the white paper was out in draft, there was a fear that all of the residential zones would be clustered into a single one. As the bill has gone into the upper house, they're back into a position now where they're supporting a finer grain of residential zone process. We're taking it one step further. Within the green paper, there was a residential character zone, a suburban character zone. Our R6 basically takes that and says, we like that idea, we'd like to see that within our LEP going forward. So, and again, within our fact sheets, we seek support for the creation of that zone because it is something we find, it's a garden setting zone. You'll see it quite extensively in places like South Allura and down in Glenbrook and around Glenbrook where you get that garden setting zone. It is just the process. The process has changed.
That was it for me. So over to Michelle for the vegetation mapping.
Okay, so moving on to something that will be of interest to quite a few of you, vegetation mapping and environmental zones in our residential areas. Now, I'm just quickly going to go through the approach we've taken to vegetation mapping in the approach to the draft LEP 2013. And just to explain, I did talk a bit more about this last night. There's a wonderful YouTube video up already if you wish to see a little bit more about that, or not. Check out fact sheet 29, because that also contains some information too. So to start off, in LEP 1991, there were maps provided to us through the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and as well we had some studies done by Smith & Smith back in 1988. And it was that information at that time that led to the production of what were the gazetted maps in LEP 1991. When it came around to LEP 2005, around 1999, there was a run over the city of aerial and infrared photos taken for the whole of the local government area. And what happened was those aerials and infrared photos were then interpreted by professionals to come up with an idea of vegetation communities across the whole of the Blue Mountains. So that's back around 2001 when that was done. And once again, Smith & Smith had some studies that informed, especially the descriptions of those communities. That information has also been available since then for our LEP 1991 areas, but they weren't brought into the official mapping line. So the information's there, but it hasn't been brought in an official sense. What was done then, getting back to LEP 2005, is that in the LEP 2005 lands, there was an amount of field validation carried out and quadrat data taken, once again around 2001. And it was that work that led to the maps that we're familiar with for those who are in LEP 2005 area. So that was the approach taken in coming up with the mapping in LEP 2005. And as you're aware, and as we touched on earlier, there is a schedule of significant vegetation that sits within both LEP 2005 and in LEP 1991. And that serves there as a bit of a catch. If we haven't mapped it, that schedule is still there so that we can pick that up as part of something to consider during the DA process. So now we come to preparing this instrument, Draft LEP 2013. So the approach we took then, and I think Principle 1 talked about coming up with the same planning approach across the LGA. So we took the approach that was followed in LEP 2005 with their mapping. And so basically we went and we had a look at those maps that were done back in 2001. And we went out and we validated parts of LEP 1991 and those vegetation maps. Once again, we had some involvement with Smith & Smith, and also we have had a team of our own people out there doing that work as well. And I don't know if there are people here who might have been given a letter saying we're going to come on and have a bit of a look at the vegetation on your land, but we did end up looking at quite a few properties, and a lot of people were very engaged in the process. So that has come up with our new vegetation maps that have informed other maps in our LEP. And once again, obviously, though it is still currently a little bit at risk because it hasn't been really done before anywhere else in the standing instrument, we're proposing to carry across our schedule of significant vegetation into our draft LEP 2013. So once again, fact sheet 29 contains a fair amount of that information, and also, for those so inclined, YouTube video. Now, we're moving on to how we are considering the application of that sort of vegetation mapping into our residential areas. And what I'm going to talk to you about now is what we are now calling the E2 zone in the draft instrument. Talked about last night, it's within the fact sheet 29, but essentially this is an equivalent zone to what's currently environmental protection under LEP 1991, and it's also equivalent to environmental protection private in LEP 2005, so for those who are familiar with those terms in those instruments. So once again, taking Principle 1 on board, applying the same planning approach across the whole of our LGA, we took the approach and the criteria that was used to come up with environmental protection private and environmental protection open space. It's just a difference in land tenure behind that, from LEP 2005, and we've extended that into our LEP 1991 lands. So to give an idea, these are the main criteria. We're looking for contiguous vegetated slopes steeper than 33%. And that contains verified significant vegetation communities, and that's the work we referred to on that previous slide, where we've had mapping that shows where we've interpreted and we believe it is. When we've gone out and verified it on the site with a site inspection, we've been able to use that and come up as one of the criteria to apply the E2 zone. Also, if it's within a watercourse corridor, that's another consideration in terms of applying that zone. And that's just highlighting that it is relating to that previous slide. The thing to bear in mind is that we are still looking to provide an adequate developable area on people's properties, especially within LEP 1991, when we're beginning to roll this slightly different approach to environmental protection zoning under LEP 2005, to be called E2 when you see it on the maps when you begin to interrogate them for your property. So will there be E2 on your land? So there's a few different scenarios, and I'll step us through them. For those people who are under LEP 2005, you probably already have, if you do have it, environmental protection private, probably on the back of your property there. That's been translated into that E2 zone. There'll be minimal change for most people in LEP 2005 in that regard. So just bear in mind, about 80% of our property within the Blue Mountains is within LEP 2005. If you were an owner at the time of when they went out to public exhibition on LEP 2005, you would have had an opportunity to engage on that type of mapping back then. But nonetheless, the approach we've taken now is to carry that across into this new instrument, following that key principle 1 of principle 2 of translating across. For some land under LEP 1991, you may already have EP at the back of or on your property. And if your property was reviewed as part of the field validation work that we did, it has either remained the same or there'll either be an increase or a decrease, but that's based upon field work. You may currently have had no EP under LEP 1991, but you may now have that proposed in the mapping. And once again, that's confirming constraints like slope and vegetation from our existing mapping across the LGA. What will that application of E2 on my land mean for me? So obviously, we've got permitted without consent. There's a few uses there. Permitted with consent, things like bushfire hazard reduction work, environmental facility, and a few other uses there. Once again, you can drill down on some of the fact sheets for a bit more of that information. But most people are finding, and we've found, obviously, in our application of this mapping, it's over land that you already know is quite constrained. Those 3 main criteria: it's steep, it's vegetated, it has significant vegetation on it, and it may also have a watercourse corridor within it. But the thing to bear in mind is with this mapping, no mapping can be perfect. This is the opportunity as part of this process to get submissions from you. If you have a look at that and see what is proposed on your land, if you disagree with that E2 is going on your land, that's when you contain that within a submission to us, and we'll consider that as part of the submission process. Yes?
Will the submission have to be backed by vegetation resource report and rate?
No, not necessarily. You'll be able to see what we believe is there, and you can say, look, I really think that's not quite right, and we'll consider it again and make a choice as to how we'll pursue that. But you don't need to go out and spend lots of money getting an expert, but just say, look, could you please have a look at it again? And that's what we do as part of the submission process. This is your opportunity to say, look, I know what you've mapped. Could you please think about that a bit more? And that's certainly what we'll do as part of our consideration of the submissions.
And then the person who actually owns the land and signed the constraint, would that be the point at which they would give you some sort of expert's opinion?
With the submission process, obviously we've put out what we think is the current mapping. If we get a submission in and we think, okay, we do look at it again, and there is a decision made that, okay, we might have a re-look at that and it might end up with a slightly different product. We don't necessarily engage with the individual submitters on that. We'll make that change as is, and it'll go up to the Department of Planning as part of the next stages in the process of getting this plan made. So you may not be aware of how we've dealt with your individual submission. We will be putting them up as part of council reports that will be considered, and they'll be available to see. But generally, we won't be responding to individual submissions in individual letters, so you may not necessarily know. But I do think we will have that available. Yeah.
Some things will be sort of more evident and others will just be a clear error. If it was, likely to be there because it's a particular vegetation community, then that may be, if you've got, some evidence to the contrary, that may be relevant. But I wouldn't be, like Michelle said, I wouldn't be encouraging people running out and spending lots of money on vegetation. Depends also on the scale of the site. How large the issues are.
Will the submissions be summarised into a standard format for the department, or will those submissions go as they are?
That probably improves the submissions report, and then they're normally also available, but so they're done in 2 ways. A report is done also for the council and for the department in terms of setting, but the submissions themselves will also be available.
And I think you had a question there?
Sorry, I just don't quite understand what the word home occupations is doing in that committed without consent. Can you just clarify that, please?
That's recognising that in some areas, especially in earlier mapping, that application of EPP or environmental protection under 91 or 05, sometimes, as I said, not all mapping is perfect, and sometimes there's a house under there. So this is recognising that if you are there, please, there is an opportunity for you to still carry out that kind of work. Yeah, yeah. The idea is that also if you find that all of a sudden your house is under E2 or EP, please let us know. That is something that we would say, oh, yep, let's see what we can do about that. So bearing in mind, there are well over, I think, 80,000 parcels within the whole of the LGA. We believe we've done a really good job, but the role of the submission process is for you to let us know where we might have missed an opportunity to revisit something like that. And as I said, we've tried to catch it as much as possible, and we've done a bit of a review, but every so often those things have popped up. So as I said, if you disagree with any part of, not just where E2 goes on your land, if you've got a comment or an issue about any part of what's being proposed on your land, the submission is where you make that clear. We do look at them individually, we do assess them on merits, and as I said, there is a process that we go through in responding to them. Okay, it just almost fell asleep there. So now I'm just going to move on to subdivision study that was done for, that we did recently, obviously 2013. And just to give you an idea, we came up with, we had a number of background studies. If you go for a bit of a wander afterwards, you'll see the planning proposal. One part of that alone is the actual instrument that we've had a bit of a look at. There are many other attachments, and there's a whole range of background studies that have gone into some of our thinking and that are available for you to look at now. So to give you an idea, we've got not just this subdivision study I'm talking about, or we'll shortly be talking about. We've got one, we'll talk a bit later on tonight about a residential development strategy. There's one on employment lands, there's one on strategic tourism and recreation. There were a few done on rural lands. Now some, for those who are looking ahead and seeing the talks that are upcoming next week, you'll appreciate we'll talk to those as part of those particular talks, but they're available now to have a look at on the website. There's a, Andy will spruik this later, but there's a USB available of the entire planning proposal with all those background studies and the whole instrument included. But to give you an idea, we had this range of background studies done. So in terms of how we went on assessing what came out of those background studies, we'll talk up front that not all recommendations were adopted in full. So what we did was we came up with a range of responses depending upon what the recommendation was. So obviously quite a few of them were supportive of our existing policy and planning, and that's good for us to hear, and we've included them within the draft LEP 2013. I have put in brackets there, or reviewed in DCP is short for Development Control Plan. That is another process that will be running shortly after this one. And that's more like the guidelines and where the controls sit for more detailed development controls. If there was a significant policy change recommended as part of those recommendations, as we explained earlier, the opportunity, the timelines that were given to us by the state meant that we probably didn't have time to really go out and explore some of these big picture strategic issues at this point. We do have a very tight timeline to meet. So we have acknowledged those, and we've said that they'll be reviewed as part of, and Andy referenced a green paper and a white paper process. For those who've been paying attention to the news and have an interest in planning, and I'm sure that's most of you, they are proposing a brand new planning act for us, which will contain a whole new approach to planning again. So where we know that's coming, all the councils across the state know that's coming. So we know that there's probably an appropriate time there to perhaps open up these bigger picture issues. We are just taking those 4 principles, translate, best fit, and come up with an instrument that is pretty much as good a fit to what we currently have as possible. And then we know in the future we've got this new plan coming along. We still don't know what the form of it will be. It's still very much up in the air. There's a fact sheet on that in our array down the back if you want to find out a bit more about it. And sometimes the recommendations in our background studies were actually outside what we could do in an LEP or a DCP. So we've noted those for further follow-up, but sometimes it's something that we can't quite accommodate within a planning instrument. It's an important instrument, but it can't quite do everything. So there are some things in the recommendations you'll see and you'll say, okay, well, that's clearly you can't put that in a land use table. And attachment 9 into the planning proposal actually goes through all the recommendations made in each of the background planning studies and gives our response to each of those recommendations. So for those with an interest in how we're taking that forward, that's the place to go to. Now, once again, these things are also open for comment and feedback. So you can have, if you've got an interest in particular ones, have a look and give us feedback and comment on those. Now, the one I'm going to talk to at the moment is a subdivision study. Now, we did a residential subdivision study focusing on our LEP 2005 lands back in 2002, and that was developing various minimum lot size scenarios around the zones that we now know as living general, living conservation and living bushland conservation. What we did in our update this year, and it started last year, was to include our LEP 1991 zones. So we had to look at our residential bushland conservation. And for those who've picked up, there's a similarity between living bushland conservation and residential bushland conservation. That's very deliberate. Those two zones are essentially pretty much the same objectives and intent. Bushland conservation is an LEP 91 specific zone that's never been looked at before in terms of this subdivision strategy approach, and our rural conservation zone. Now, this work was carried out. It's attachment 12 to the planning proposal. So once again, you can drill down and have a look at see how that's been done. And it informs the study that we'll talk to a little bit later, which is our residential development strategy. Obviously, what you can subdivide leads into the type of residential development and the number of lots and so forth that you will get. Now, there's no need to take this on board. This is just to show you that as part of what we did, we had to get a very clear understanding of our current controls in LEP 2005 and LEP 1991 in terms of subdivision. You can have a look at this later on the PowerPoints if you wish. And bearing in mind that this little circle I put up here is development excluded land. Now, that's a key provision in terms of subdivision across the city, and that's in terms of, once again, one of those key principles. We've translated that across into the new draft LEP 2013. So once again, don't feel like you're going to have to read down this and get an understanding. We will have information further about that. In terms of our approach to that subdivision review, as I said, we've taken an approach of translating existing policy into the draft LEP 2013. Now, at a technical thing, the state government is moving us towards a standard instrument which has a very map-based process, and they've required us to come up with approaches around minimum lot size and lot averaging. We don't have a lot of that within our LEP, especially in LEP 1991. We have controls more like no subdivision or 8 per hectare. So this is where our best fit came up. We've looked at those existing controls for subdivision in 91 and 05, and if there's no equivalent in the draft, in the standard instrument suite, we've had to use a new tool like minimum lot size or lot averaging to try and achieve on the ground the same result. As I said, the approach we've taken is translation of existing controls. So now we're looking at, as part of that subdivision review, things like lot yield. We looked at a number of lot size scenarios, and basically we wanted to arrive at an equivalent lot yield across our LGA, particularly in our LEP 1991 areas, to say that we really have pretty much taken an approach of translation and best fit to get the same result now under what's being proposed in draft LEP 2013 as to what you would get under existing subdivision controls in 91 and 05. And as I said, we've carried forward across the concept of development excluded land. Oh, and I think that looks like it's pretty much the end of what I wanted to talk about, and I do think so. As I said, actually I will go back to that. New clauses carrying forward development excluded land. Please, once again, we're relying upon your review of the subdivision controls as they're being proposed to your land. We have had to take a very strategic approach to this. When you begin to look at it at your site-specific areas, like your particular land, have a look and see what it means for you. And if you think that we haven't kept your current lot yields and moving forward, this is your opportunity to say, look, I think it doesn't quite work for me. And we will once again look at it on merit and see how we might be able to look at that in terms of moving forward and responding. As I said, the intent very clearly in those key principles is to come up with a translation of the controls that you currently have. Have a look. This is the opportunity for people to have a look and see what's being proposed. We haven't been able to test it on all of our lots, but this is where the role of subdivision and the role of people being engaged with the process becomes vitally important to us. We need your feedback to make sure that we've got that translation and that best fit approach as it applies to you, and make sure that we've got that approach pretty much right. And I'll just hand on to Martin to come up and talk about the residential development strategy.
Thanks, Michelle, and good evening, everybody. I've just got a few slides to talk about the residential development strategy. That is one of the background documents to this draft LEP. So I just want to give you a bit of a flavour for what's involved with that strategy and some of the background to it. Okay. It had its origins back in 1996 and it was reviewed in 2002 to accompany LEP 2005. As Les mentioned, LEP 2005 was prepared to address the urban areas, so that's what this strategy focused on. And it was also done to support Council's request for an exemption from the Seniors Living Housing SEP, and Council at the time did not think that that SEP that the state government proposed to introduce reflected Council's idea of where it wanted housing to occur. So that was the background to why it was done. Anytime you do a residential strategy, you're basically trying to match the future demand for housing to supply, and you overlay that against local conditions and things like that. So the strategy included things like a demographic analysis, which is a very important underpinning of that sort of strategy. It looked at the existing housing characteristics and it tried to assess what the future housing needs and preferences would be. It was also based upon a set of principles. There's 8 principles there, and if you have a look, they're all quite important, but particularly number 3, which is just suggesting that in doing a residential strategy, we're just looking at organic growth that's relevant to the Blue Mountains. We're not looking to accommodate a significant proportion of the growth of the Sydney region as a whole. And again, at the time that was done, that was an important response to some initiatives from the Department of Planning where they were trying to foist particular dwelling numbers on individual councils. And Council took a stance saying, no, we just think we're best to accommodate local growth, and that's due to the location of the Blue Mountains in relation to Sydney, on the periphery of the Sydney metropolitan area, the environmental sensitivity and the relative lack of infrastructure. Another important principle is number 6, the third from the bottom, and that's just saying that where growth is to occur, we think it's best located in existing centres, and that's because the existing infrastructure is there, services are there, and it just allows for more economic utilisation of those services. So that's another important principle. The 2002 strategy was updated as part of doing this LEP. It was updated when we thought we were involved with the process that Lee spoke about, which was rolling all the LEPs together. We reviewed those principles and thought, yeah, they're still very appropriate for this review, but that review also took into account the LEP 1991 lands, which, as we've said, were the more rural and lands on the urban periphery. Those are those highlights coming up now. As I mentioned, underpinning any good residential strategy is a sound knowledge of your population and what it's doing over time. And we had a close look at past trends and future trends when we did the update. I guess there's a couple of interesting features of that graph. If you look at it up to about here, you can see the population rises fairly steeply. It's something like, and this is just a rough calculation, but it's roughly about 1,400 or 1,500 people per year. Then it seemed to tail off a little bit, maybe from about there, about 2000, 2001. And the rate of increase does slow down quite significantly to perhaps about 500 people a year. And what's also coming in after that is that we base it on a lot of different population projections. There's 3 or 4 different projections, but they're all fairly similar in their trends, aren't they? They all show a fairly consistent flattening out of that population curve. So looking up to about 2031, we're not going to get a huge population increase over what's there now. I mean, we're going to get a natural increase, but the rate of increase has slowed down a lot over what's happened previously. And just to support that with some figures about what's actually happened on the ground, over the last 10 years, roughly 151 detached dwellings and 59 multi-unit dwellings per year have been built. And looking at the projected population increases that were on the previous slide, we think it's a reasonable assumption that that level of growth might continue. So that's kind of what we're planning for. And that's a very modest level of growth compared to a lot of council areas. As I mentioned, doing a residential strategy, you look at the supply and the demand. So looking at what lands might be suitable for residential development in the future, we've taken an approach where we've looked at existing vacant land without subdivision potential and looking at vacant land that does have some subdivision potential as well. And we've come up with a figure here which is very notional, 7,219. We think that's about the number of vacant lots in the Blue Mountains, and that's very much a gross figure because, as I mentioned previously as well, you have to overlay the potential supply against local characteristics. And in the Blue Mountains, there's quite a lot of natural constraints to development. There's a lot of environmental constraints of vegetation that Michelle mentioned. There's an issue with some of the roads. They don't lead easily to giving access to developable areas. And there's wastewater and sewer issues. And there's also bushfire issues, as we know. So that figure I just mentioned would be reduced quite significantly when you're trying to work out a total amount of developable land in the future. That's all I had to say about the residential strategy. It is available, so if you want to have a good look at it and then talk to one of us about it or email us a question about it. But yeah, please have a look at the information. There's a copy up the back there. And I'll hand over to Andy now.
Thanks, Martin. And good evening, everybody. Just wanted to say thanks for coming out tonight. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the public exhibition process, but I feel like I'm preaching to the converted because you're here tonight and we really need to get to the community out there and to the wider community beyond. Just to recap the process, Lee talked a little while ago. We're clearly have done this as a very short track exercise, and we think we've come up with some fantastic outcomes and some very good outcomes. However, up till June last year, we were working on a conversion of our existing LEP 2005 process. Since June 2012, over the last year or so, we've been working on developing our draft LEP 13. In terms of council involvement, the council adopted, with a view to forwarding to the department in September this year, the instrument that's forwarded to the department, came back from them on 1st of November with an instruction to be out on exhibition before Christmas this year. So hence things have been really quite truncated. We do have, however, an extended exhibition process. We managed to secure an extension to it. So rather than 28 days, stat minimum, we originally had an 8-week process. That's been extended to 3 full calendar months. So we're happy with that. We're not, clearly the process of starting now isn't absolutely ideal, but it's one that gets us rolling. But we do have further time post-Christmas, and we are looking at how we can enhance the process perhaps in the early February period with further public engagement throughout. So in terms of our exhibition locations, we have a broad array of community engagement going on. First up, we have exhibition locations. So we're using our libraries right now. So if you're looking at Katoomba Library, Springwood Library and Blaxland Library, Springwood and Blaxland purely because Springwood's a bit of a building site right now. We have copies of the instrument as printed. And we also have copies, I understand, for loan for 3-day loan periods. So if you really want to take the full set out, take your car because you're going to need it. There's a very hefty set of documentation that is sat at the back with Erica. It's something that if you really want to plough through all of the background studies in paper form, you can do that and make your submission. Most of the information is available and set up to be viewed online. That's how we've really set it up. Hopefully you all received your notification postcard. So this went out back into last week. Some people had it on Friday. I know that some people had it Monday, Tuesday. look, clearly what we're doing is we are recording these. The information from last night was up on the website by lunchtime today, so we've already had some elements of feedback on that, so that's great. That's our way of trying to ensure there is broader communication out there. People that can't make these sessions are able to access it. Perhaps people saw the Gazette yesterday, big double-page spread, giving a bit more background and a bit more information about how people can go about accessing, and we have produced a lot of information. So again, at the back of the room, we have the full sets of information out there. We're pointing people primarily to our website. We're quite proud of our website. It's when we looked across at how other local government areas had run their LEP exhibition processes, we picked the best of that, and I think we enhanced upon it. So we built in functionality there that means there is a full set of information. It might be somewhat forbidding when you first look because there is an awful lot of information to go through, but all of the instrument documentation is there, a vast array of fact sheets, and I'll talk about those in a little while, information about how to make an inquiry, how to engage planners, and then how to make your submissions. In addition, there's a Q&A functionality in there as well, and if we find issues of general principle that we can put up there to advise and guide people, we'll be refreshing that on a daily basis. And I was having a chat with Erica, who's here tonight, about one particular inquiry that we think's that first good Q&A type response, and we'll get that up there tomorrow. So we're active. It's not a passive process. It's clearly an active process from Council's perspective. In terms of the fact sheets, each of the speakers tonight has talked about the fact sheets and the background documentation. There are 31 in total. It's a lot of information to plough through. We understand that. However, if you have a particular interest or a particular area that you are interested, you should be guided to a relevant fact sheet. So, we try to make it simple and digestible and usable for everybody. We have some further information sessions. We've got 2 more next week. So our session next Tuesday is in the Carrington. It's on rural matters. We're based up there because most of the work on rural areas has been focused on the Megalong and the Mounts. That's our primary rural catchments. We wanted a location that's accessible for those guys. And then on the Thursday, we're back here with a business and industrial section. So we're just trying to theme it, trying to make sure we get key messages out and that those interested can pick and choose certain sessions. As I said before, we haven't yet fixed, but we probably will be looking at further sessions come February. They're more likely to be very short form presentations, but then just with planners in the room because we're aware that people will want to talk about their own individual issues, their own parcels. That's very difficult to handle in a broad public setting, but we're just trying to make ourselves as available as possible, and we'll be looking at a range of settings and environments that the planning team can be located in, as well as their current location, which is as a drop-in centre in the Katoomba HQ. And I should say that drop-in is available from 9 till 2 on a daily basis. We staff it. We're also available on phone lines. I'll probably mention that again in a minute. In terms of the whole information, you'll see there is a huge pile of paper at the back there if you wanted to acquire a copy of the draft instrument and all of the background documentation. Some have. It costs in excess of $400 a set. However, for simply $10, you can buy the whole thing on a USB, and Erica has a supply at the back. So please, if you're interested in reading further, that's the best way to access it. Again, as downloads, if you're anywhere remote, we know that the download speeds are slow up here in general, and this is by far and away the simplest way that you're going to be access the whole data set and the full information. So that's, I'd recommend that as a way to go. As I said before, just engaging a planner now, we have dedicated phone lines, so the 4723 5999 and the 4780 5999 hits a planner. And if the first planner on that roster is engaged, it will default to another one and to another one. We've got 4 or 5 on duty at the present, and if you get the last one, then it will take a message and we'll get back to you. So that's basically how that's operating. For the foreseeable, we'll be operating the drop-in centre at Katoomba, so it's just upstairs in the lobby in Katoomba, and we will be moving that facility around. So we're just looking at viable and accessible locations around the LGA. We'll probably be in the libraries, I suspect, given that Springwood's largely out of action in terms of viable meeting space. Again, that we'll be advertising future drop-in sessions around the LGA, probably from post-New Year onwards, and we'll sort those out then. So first up, if you have questions or an inquiry, we have a bespoke inquiries email address that will come through to the team. It's a little bit lengthy, but actually if you're on the website and click it, then obviously that's the easiest way to do it. But it is that inquiries DLEP 2013 at BMCC. So that will go straight to our planning team, and we'll consider those and respond to you directly, or log those in the inquiry database and put them in the Q&A process. The Q&A sits on the back of the Have Your Say website. So again, as a main portal, just be there and you'll be able to see updates and refreshes as they're rolling on. Finally, making a submission. So this is the key part. This is where we really need to encourage you to engage, make your submissions known, and get them informally. This is the formal process that gets reported, well, considered by officers in the first instance, summarised and reported to council, often collated because there'll be clearly a series of like submissions if there's about a particular zone. Hopefully we can elicit some support for our R6 zone as proposed. There will clearly be people with mapping issues. We'll be categorising those and clustering those together. The submission process is clearly articulated in a fact sheet on the Have Your Say website, and ideally through an email submission, submissions LEP 2013 on the email. However, clearly we'll also accept any form of written submission over the counter or via post. That's it in terms of the presentation for this evening. We're going to hang around now for another 20 minutes or so if you want to catch a planner and have a chat about anything particular. Otherwise, please engage the process. Engage us on a one-on-one basis through those drop-in functionality. That's the best way that we can talk specifically. We have the interactive mapping in front of us. We can talk specifically about your issues, your parcel, your lot, your desired outcomes. Otherwise, we'll see you at one of the future sessions. Thank you very much.